BBC Radio Wales. Now, work takes up a great deal of our life. If you're full-time, you can clock up over 2,000 hours a year. So when problems sometimes occur, it's important to get the correct advice. This afternoon, we've definitely hired the right person for the job. Elissa Thursfield, Head of Employment Law at Gamlin Solicitors in North Wales, is here to answer your questions on employment law. Welcome back. How are you keeping, Elissa?
Thanks very much. What an intro. Oh, it's great to be back. Thank you so much for having me on.
I hope it's sunny where you are as well.
I'm in Abersoch. It's absolutely beautiful today.
Oh, beautiful part of the world. Thank you very much for joining us. So one of the biggest employment news stories to hit the headlines, for many, many years happened just a few weeks ago when P&O bosses sacked 800 workers without any notice at all. Can you briefly remind us what happened last month?
So this was a huge story. As the news broke the morning this all happened, 800 members of staff had been made redundant without notice and utilising a pre-recorded Zoom video, I think it was. So there was no consultation, there was no discussions with the unions. These people woke up to this video message which told them all that their employments were being terminated, and that was the end of it, which was enormously shocking for a company of that size and experience. Obviously, they know there's procedures that they should be going through, and it's not been out the press since.
And it's worth mentioning this is P&O ferries, not cruises. I mean, I mentioned P&O cruise the other day to someone. They were like, "Oh, we're not going with them," and I was like, "No, it's two completely different companies." So this is P&O ferries that we're chatting about. I mean, as an employment lawyer, what was going through your mind? What was the first thing you thought about when you heard about this story? Because I don't know much about the law when it comes to employment, but I was pulling my hair out.
Yeah, I mean, in all honesty, it's either they didn't take advice or they didn't listen to it. It's one of those sort of head in your hands moment where you think, okay, I can understand you're trying to do this because you need to save the business money and you want to make the business viable. But the PR fallout and the cost of these ships being stuck in port has surely outweighed any of those, potential savings. I just cannot see how this has been the right thing for that business to do.
And can you just explain to us what were the rights and wrongs of this particular redundancy process?
So if there were roles that are at risk, for a redundancy situation, either you're restructuring or you're saying that a role is no longer required, there's a process that you have to go through. Now, if you're making more than 20 people redundant in a 90-day period, you have to follow what's called collective consultation. So that's got additional rules and it's a bit more complex and there's more requirements. So here, where we're looking at 800 staff members, absolutely, it should have been collective consultation. Now, what that means is they should have notified the Redundancy Payment Service, so the RPS, before the start of consultation. They should have consulted with trade unions and elected employee representatives. They should have provided information to representatives and staffs about the redundancies, why they're doing it, what they're going to gain, and give them the chance to consider it and have their say, respond to any requests for further information, and then ultimately give the notice of termination. So they should have been engaging staff in this process, not, as I say, just having them wake up to the message that their employment had been ended.
Did they do anything right in this?
Other than perhaps after the event admit that they've done it wrong, I can see very little that they've done right, to be honest. I do wonder if I've been in this job too long and I've become a cynic. However, I have very little positive things to say about this process.
At the time, what options would have been open to P&O if they claimed they were facing having to make huge financial savings? There was just no other option for them.
Well, in this situation, I'm not entirely sure redundancy was the right thing for them to have done. Redundancy is where the roles no longer exist. These roles do exist. They've outsourced them. They've gone to find cheap labour that they're bringing in from abroad, which in the reality is what we would call a TUPE process, where rather than getting rid of roles, you're transferring them, so you're outsourcing that work. But if they needed to make money, there's other things that the business could have looked at. How much are they paying senior managers? Are they overstaffed in particular areas? What are their port fees? What are their actual costs of operating outside of staff? There's been no indication, because there hasn't been a consultation, as to what else they have looked at, and that would have formed the core of a consultation process. They should have been showing these staff members, look, these are all the options and this is why we're down to this is the last resort, there's nothing else we can do. But we don't get the benefit of that information because they didn't bother to do the consultation.
Yeah, and they've said now that the staff will be compensated. But, long-term wise, the damage to the company, the organisation, the brand, the reputation, I mean, they kind of underestimated the consequences, didn't they?
I think they did. I mean, look, it's not the first time this happened in the industry. Years ago, there was something similar with Irish ferries, and, perhaps they thought that this was something that the public would forget about. We've got the pandemic. There's obviously, the troubles in Ukraine. There's so much going on. Who's going to notice 800 people have been made redundant? Well, lots of people did. It was a wrong step, frankly, particularly given the fallout.
Thank you very much for taking us to our advice hour. And our expert today is on employment law from solicitor Elissa Thursfield. And if you have a question for her, it's easy. You can give us a call on 03700 100 110. You can text 81012 and I'll be sure to put your questions to Elissa. Now, we spoke briefly earlier about the businesses and, how they're financially struggling at the moment, the rise of cost of living affecting all of us. And I guess one option a lot of us might be thinking about is it time or when to ask our boss for a pay rise? I mean, what advice could you give anyone who's considering to do this?
I mean, you're totally right in terms of why people might be wanting to ask for a pay rise. It's a bit of a perfect storm, isn't it? Cost of living's gone up, fuel, electricity, it's all a bit horrible out there. In terms of going to ask for a pay rise, my mantra is always, if you don't ask, you don't get. It's always something that's worth doing. However, it's got to be done in the right way. And if you're knocked back, it's to avoid the temptation of either taking it too personally or seeing the relationship as broken. Because whilst the cost of living has gone up for individuals, the cost of employing people and the cost of running a business has also gone up as well. So there may not be as much cash flying around as perhaps there has been in previous years.
And how can you avoid falling at the first hurdle? I mean, should you do lots of planning? Should you do some research? Have a look at what people are earning in your level of work? What is the best way about going in so at least get the conversation flowing? Because these things don't happen. It's very rare that you go and say, can I have a pay rise? And it happens right there and then.
Exactly, you're absolutely right. And with something like this, preparation is always the key. You may well have a restriction in your contract that prevents you from discussing pay with people that are your peers or people that you work with. There's lots of resources online where you can go do something that's called benchmarking your salary. So you go and have a look at what you're paid compared to other people in your industry or other people at your level or with your skills. So have a look at figures like that, and then also have a think about what it is that you bring to the business. What are your skills? Where is your career going? And almost, sort of set out a sales pitch. This is why I'm worth what it is that I want you to pay me. And then I would suggest, never sort of just walk in and land it on somebody. Book an appointment, set some time aside so nobody feels rushed, and have that discussion in a calm and sensible way and present why you believe you are worth more.
And is there a time scale of how long should go by before you get a pay rise? I mean, let's say you had a pay rise 5 years ago, nothing since, and you're thinking, since 5 years ago, I've come leaps and bounds, I'm doing so much more, I've got so many skills, this pitch that you mentioned. Is there a time scale, or is it just different for everybody and every business?
No legal timescale other than if you're on the national minimum wage. Obviously, that should climb every year with the increases. Most contracts of employment do say that you may be considered for a pay rise, but there's no obligation for the employer to do so. So there's no legal trigger, so to speak, for a pay rise to be implemented or even be considered. What I would say is, if it's been a few years, are the decision makers aware of how you've progressed? Do they know what you're bringing to the business? Because if it's not your direct line manager who's making the pay decision, it could well be that by staying quiet, that you've gone under the radar. So working out, who's the decision maker in this process and whose support do I need? That's also really important as well. If you're in the situation where, for example, if you're a woman in the workplace and you're seeing men around you getting promoted, or you find out they're on more pay, that's a very different issue. That's an equal pay issue. And there are lots of sort of very protective laws around this now. And if you do think there's an equal pay issue, you need to be talking to a solicitor, because there could well be a legal course of action that you could take to ensure that your pay is equalised with that of your colleagues.
But how can you find out what your colleagues are earning? I mean, I know situations where people have come and said to somebody who's battling, I am earning this much, to kind of help them with their not battle, but, with their discussions with their management. I mean, is there a way of finding out what the people who are working on your level of work and role, what they're earning?
I mean, some employers are very open about it and they will publish that information. If you're working for a large employer, they're under an obligation to publish gender pay gap reporting and also reports about, what they're paying people. So you may be able to find out that way. If you're working for someone who, like I said before, has got those restrictions about discussing your pay, then it can be very difficult to find out what your colleagues are on. And it's only when there's sort of been a slip of the tongue or someone said something out of turn that they shouldn't have done that you might find that information out. Sometimes, however, when they're recruiting for new positions, they might be recruiting for someone who's on the same level of you, but you find out they're being paid $5,000 more. That can be quite illustrative, really. What you sometimes get told is, well, look, there's a skills shortage. We're going out there to try and find the talent, but then equally say, well, look, I am the talent. Why aren't I being considered for this? Why am I not seen as someone who's got that much value to the business? Yeah. And it's not always taking, what's said to you and challenging that sometimes, but in the right and in the professional way.
And let's just say you're really super blessed. You go in to see your manager and you're like, I think I should have a pay rise because of this, you give your reasons. And they're like, okay, well, how much do you think you should get? You should have a figure in your mind before you go in of, I don't know whether it's percentages.
Know what you want. Go in there with a figure of what you want. And I think it's a British thing, actually. So I've worked internationally before, and other cultures don't seem to have the same issue we do when it comes to talking about money. Yes. And that when someone gives you a positive reaction to that question, you almost don't want to try your luck too much and think, I would have asked this much more, but if I knock a few quid an hour off, I reckon I could get that. No, tell them what you want and then negotiate. It doesn't have to just be a one-way street.
And tell them a bit more than what you actually want. So then in negotiation, maybe you'll get what you want. I don't know. It's so hard. You are right. Be less British and be more Canadian or American about it. Just go in, sell yourself and get exactly what you deserve. Now, Elissa, is money the only factor people seek to negotiate?
Not at all. I mean, particularly at the moment with cost of living and cost of things like transport. So, I think train fares have gone up, fuel's gone up, cost of childcare has gone up. Some people don't always want to be in the office. After COVID, we've seen in many businesses and many sectors that working from home can be effective. And they see by working from home, they can reduce reliance on childcare and they can reduce commuting costs. So if they're not eligible for a pay rise and they want to get to grips with the cost of living, that's potentially an outlet in terms of what else they can negotiate with their employer to try and get a handle on those costs.
Very good advice, as always. Thank you very much, Elissa. Elissa Thursfield, Head of Employment Law at Gamlin Solicitors, is in North Wales. And Abersoch, you said, did you? Was it where are you right now?
Abersoch, yeah.
Abersoch. Absolutely beautiful. Are you on holidays then?
No, I actually live here. My home office is.
Oh, I see. Oh, fantastic. Okay. So since the last time we spoke, Wales is now on alert level 0, finally. We're getting used to this new normal, even though COVID still affects many people. There must be some challenges employers need to consider to kind of make staff feel safe. What are those challenges at the moment?
Definitely. I mean, even though we're down at alert level 0, so people who have got their vaccinations no longer need to isolate if they have COVID. But that in itself has presented a whole new raft of challenges for employers. So if somebody tests positive, if they feel well enough, they could potentially attend work. That causes other people to feel uneasy. They want those people to be sent home. So there's lots of new sort of nitty-gritty problems that employers are having to face as a result of the reduction in restrictions.
So each company decides for themselves whether the person who tests positive comes into office or not?
Yeah, so the difficulty that we've got here is if somebody says that they are well enough to attend work, if the employer then decides to send them home, technically that would have to be on full pay because the employee is presenting and is able to attend. If someone says that they're not fit, that they're not feeling very well, they get their sick pay in the usual way. Where we're coming across the difficulties is where you've got someone who wants to come to work, they want to work, but their colleagues are not very happy about it, and equally the employer's not thrilled about the prospect of having to pay them full pay to be at home.
Well, ideally, hopefully, they can work from home if they're feeling up to it, which would kind of solve that problem. I mean, to what extent are we within our rights to request a flexible working pattern, especially, if we've enjoyed working from home? Do we have to return to the office?
So if your employer has allowed you to work from home during the pandemic, you've got a reasonable ground to be able to say to them, look, this is how productive I was, this is how well this has all worked, I would like to continue to do this. Simply because you've done it during the pandemic doesn't give you that absolute right. Now, if an employer decides that they're not prepared to support that after a conversation with you, then you'd need to put in a formal flexible working request. That would need to be dealt with under a process by the employer. So there'd be a formal meeting to discuss it. They would have to go away and have a think about it properly. And there's only a limited number of reasons that an employer can refuse a flexible working request. So say, for example, if you wanted to adjust your hours as well, if your employer could say, well, look, there's no customer demand at that time, or we can't shuffle the work around, or give you those operational reasons why it's not going to work, then that would be lawful. You then have a right of appeal, and then once that's completed, that is essentially the end of the process. Now, if your employer were to say, for example, no, we're not prepared to allow you to work from home because we just don't like it, we think people are watching television all day, that's not a lawful reason. They're very rigid in terms of the ability to say no using a lawful basis. So you could potentially have legal recourse if your employer was unfair about it or didn't follow a process.
They're not watching television all day. They've got BBC Radio Wales in the background while they work. That's what they've been told.
Well, I have the radio on sometimes when I'm working. Sometimes it does help me concentrate if I'm not on calls. Drafting. So no, I'm an advocate of having a little bit of gentle background noise.
I like some noise, but television, daytime television, no. So tell me, if there's friction in the workplace, people have different opinions on, maintaining perhaps some of the regulations. Some people want to continue wearing masks. Some people don't want to wear masks. I mean, how do you deal with maintaining those regulations with different opinions within a workspace?
The reality is that the bottom line should always be that people should be respectful of how other people feel. Not everybody has to get on at work. You don't have to agree with everybody, but you should respect their opinions and you should respect their skills and what they bring to the company. So if you've got people who are disagreeing about things like masks, social distancing, vaccinations, and positive testing and all that sort of stuff, it should never descend into anything beyond, well, I don't agree with your opinion, but we need to move on professionally. The message from the employer should be that communication should always be cordial and professional. If there's a serious issue, it should be escalated to a line manager and dealt with formally. We should never be allowing things to descend into disputes at work because of differences of opinion, because it can be quite dangerous. And things very rarely stay contained to the issue that sparked it all off. Often you find things sort of go out of control and you end up with all sorts of other issues thrown in there as well. So it's nipping things in the bud early, supporting that positive communication and spotting the real issues and dealing with those formally.
You're right, communication is the key thing. Just make sure you make it clear to your colleagues, your management, what it is that you are not comfortable with. Thank you very much for all your help, Elissa. Now, we've had 2 anonymous texts for you, Elissa, and I'll start with the first one, which is asking, what is the law on vehicle tracking system with your company?
Okay, so there's 2 sort of issues here when it comes to vehicle tracking. One is, yes, an employer can do it. However, you should be aware that the device is there. They should not be doing it covertly. And then the second, once you're aware of that device, is that you should be aware of how that information is used. So it's not just a case of, well, there's a device there that an employer can do what they want with it. They need to be very clear on why they're collecting that information and what it's going to be used for. So the short answer is yes, they can do it, but there are some hurdles that they need to get over first.
Why do they do it?
So we work with a few businesses that do undertake vehicle tracking. So those that have got HGV vehicles, it's very useful. So it's actually fascinating when you go to their offices and you see they have these big screens and they can see where all the trucks are, so they can see what deliveries are happening, where and when, who's late, who's stuck in traffic, so they can keep customers informed, whether there's a delay in terms of their deliveries. Sometimes the decision is made to introduce devices such as dash cam devices for employees who are regularly either being done for speeding, or there seems to be a pattern of events in terms of damage to vehicles or being involved in incidents. So there are a number of reasons why they might do it. In larger vehicles or in vehicles where you've got employees who are subject to tachographs and things like that, it can be to ensure that an employee is actually doing what they should be doing with that tacho.
Yes. So if you've just got a company car, like a normal car, you drive to work with, you drive home, and then sometimes you have to go long distance for work with that car, how do they justify having a tracker on you for that?
So again, with things like that, what they could say is that it's health and safety reasons. So they could say so that if you are doing long drives, so that they can make sure that you're not driving, for 12, 13, 14 hours in one go, and that you are taking appropriate breaks. Equally, if you are driving that much for work, to make sure that you are working, that you are attending customer premises, and that you're not, going off into town doing a bit of shopping, having your hair done. If that car is for work purposes. They could well justify it on the basis to say, well, it's to make sure that you're using it for the reason that we've given it to you.
Fair enough. And say I find out there is a tracking device on my car from my employer and they never told me, what are my rights then? What do I need to do?
So in those sorts of circumstances, my advice would be that that person raises a grievance. So they raise a formal complaint with their employer and that they ask for it to be removed until that grievance has been heard and an outcome given and a justification given for why the device is there.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much to the person who asked that question. I feel like I've learned a lot. We've also had another anonymous question which asks, can you get sacked if you've been off sick for a long time, been with a company for over 10 years? Thanks.
So the really sort of sad answer and the hard truth really here is that, yes, somebody can be sacked due to long-term sickness. The reason for that dismissal would be classed as a capability dismissal, that because of long-term sickness absence, that person is no longer capable of performing their contract of employment. Now, it's quite a complex area of the law. If someone's been off for a long time, the reality is that the employer should have been holding regular meetings or welfare checks with that staff member, holding capability meetings to go through a process before the decision is made to decide to dismiss somebody. It should never be as simple as, well, this person's been off for 12 months, therefore here's a letter just to get rid of them. It does not work like that. There is still a process the employer has to go through to look at what could be done perhaps to get that person back to work, whether there's any adjustments that could be made to the role to help alleviate any difficulties they might be experiencing because of health or disability, and make sure that all options have been considered before that decision to dismiss is made. If an employer doesn't jump through those hoops and they don't consider those points, then potentially it will be an unfair dismissal. And if that person's got a disability, it could potentially be a disability discrimination claim.
Yeah, and when we're talking about being off work a long time, what is considered a long time? I mean, is 6 months considered a long time? Is there a period, or just it's a discretion of each company?
It varies from company to company, and it usually comes down to how well staffed and resourced businesses are. So for larger businesses that have got lots of resources, or they've got the ability to tap into temporary workers or agency staff, then what's classed as long-term or unsustainable does become a bit longer. And what you can often see is, particularly where there's been disputes, and we look at cases where this sort of thing is argued, that these are staff members who've been off for sometimes over a year, up to 2 years. Personally, I've dealt with cases where people have been off for up to 3-4 years, and they're arguing that an employer should have waited longer. For smaller employers, they might only have 2 or 3 staff members. It can have a really critical impact if you lose a staff member. If you can't afford to replace them with agency because you're still paying sick pay, they're still accruing holiday, then, you could make an argument that actually, less than 6 months is long-term and unsustainable. It comes down to the individual facts. If an employer, however, is saying, look, you've been off for like 8-9 months, it's long term, we've gone through a process, an employee says, oh, look, actually, I'm coming to the end of treatment, or my physio says I'm going to be all right in a month or 2, that can kind of change what's unreasonable or not.
Right.
If there's no prospect of, look, we've no idea when this person's coming back, that decision to dismiss is probably going to be more reasonable. But if someone says, look, just give me another couple of weeks and I think I'm going to be a bit better, if you decide to dismiss in those circumstances, it's probably going to be something that could be challenged.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for explaining everything so beautifully. We are into the last section of our employment chat with solicitor Elissa Thursfield, who's joining us this afternoon. Now, I wanted to speak to you about, changes that has happened over the last couple of years, and many of us enjoyed, certain elements of working from home, and one of those being, being able to wear more casual clothes when we're working from home. I mean, what would you say to someone who would really like to continue with that kind of a more relaxed vibe as they return to the office?
So again, this is something that's been a really sort of unusual fallout from the pandemic, really. And we call it like Zoom dress, where you've got a blouse on top and your pyjama bottoms on the bottom, because, as long as you look smart up top, then, nobody is any the wiser.
Yeah. And,
people are saying they're comfortable when they're working and it makes a more pleasant work environment. And actually being buttoned up in a tie and a restricted jacket, or, tights and pencil skirts, that it's not the most comfortable work attire to be in, and they don't want to do it anymore. So again, it's a communication thing. It's, what sort of industry are you in? What are your client or customer expectations? If you're someone who's in an office that you're not really customer facing, and actually there's no reason why you can't wear something a bit more casual, as long as you're clean and well presented, then, it's a question to put to your line manager or to your boss to say, well, look, does it really impact my work if I come into the office a little bit more casually dressed? In some industries, there's still very strong client expectations about what professional advisors and professional services, appear and look like. But if you're not in one of those positions, then certainly there's a conversation to be had. But certainly, even in my industry, some of the big London firms are relaxing dress codes slightly and have dress down days and things like that. So I do think the world's changing slightly.
I think at BBC Wales, we kind of were chilled vibes way before the pandemic. I mean, I've been here 20 years. I haven't seen people in suits and ties and things like that in the time I've been here, unless you're on air, but people get changed to, be a bit more formal. But around the office, it's always been jeans and tops, and I don't really see people walking around with suits.
No, and I think there has been a bit of a culture shift. One thing I would say, I went to a uniformed school, is that when I then went to college and was able to wear whatever I wanted, it was very exciting, but you have this sort of anxiety in the morning of, oh, good grief, what am I going to wear?
Yeah.
What am I going to look like? What's everybody else wearing? So it does bring that additional level of stress, whereas where you wear suits and things like that, it almost feels like a uniform. It's a bit of a no-brainer and it's very easy. My stepson would kill me for mentioning this, but he started his first city job in London a few weeks ago, and he went and sort of staked the place out the day before to see what people were wearing, so he could get an idea of dress code, to take the first day nerves out of it a little bit. So it is something people give a lot of thought to.
Absolutely. Now, is it me, or does it feel like this is quite an interesting time, for both employers and employees to create a new set of working patterns? It could be a positive thing, couldn't it?
Absolutely. There's a real opportunity here post-pandemic for businesses to transform their cultures, the way the world sees them and the way they operate. And, we shouldn't need an excuse to do it. Businesses should evolve and look to, be providing the best services that they possibly can, but also the best experiences that they can for their employees. Better engaged staff often produce better results. So, no, it's certainly a time where we're seeing lots of change. And, I'd like to think it's something that would be, studied and reflected on. on in years to come as to, a real turning point in the British workforce.
Well, so many companies had issues with people working from home before the pandemic, and then everything operated, and in some instances operated better than before. And employers very much overnight realized, actually, we're getting a fair amount of work done at home. And it's not such a bad thing. And maybe it's not such a bad thing if people can come into work not so much in their pajamas, but in more comfortable attire, right?
Yes, exactly. And I think, the ability to work from home saved a lot of businesses.
Yes.
There was a real sort of relief, I think, that businesses could continue to operate. And
That's
I think
true.
they need to sort of count those blessings and then see, well, look, how do we go forward with this?
And we were talking about earlier about people being long-term sickness. It could be some people can actually work from home, doing bits of work and be able to tap back in while they gradually work their way back into the office, which maybe wouldn't have been possible before. So again, another positive. It's been phenomenal chatting with you today. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Elissa.
Thank you for having me on. A pleasure as always.
Thank you. Chat to you soon.